Now we left off last video talking about how the Federal Reserve uses open market operations to manipulate the amount of reserves in the banking system, thereby affecting interest rates, thereby affecting bank lending, thereby affecting aggregate demand. So let's look at that a little more closely. What we see here, this is the Federal Reserve, right? This is the public, this is the Federal Reserve, this is the public, and this is the banking system. Now, open market operations is getting the public to buy more or less of government bonds, thereby putting more or less reserves in the banking system. So, for example, when the Fed buys bonds, so the Federal Reserve buys a bond, so the bond goes to the Fed, but what comes out? Money, right? The Fed buys a bond, so it gives money to the public. The public then deposits that money into their bank, and bank reserves go up. Well, when the Federal Reserve sells bonds, they get the bond, and they sell the bond to somebody else, right? And they receive money as a result, right? Because they're selling something and they get money. So money goes to the Fed. And where does the public get that money? They have to withdraw it from the banking sector, right? And so reserves leave the banking sector, and that goes down as a result. So can you see how this buying and selling of government bonds causes the public to withdraw or deposit money into the banking system, thereby affecting the reserves in the system? So like I said, a bond is simply an IOU. When you borrow money, when the government borrows money from individuals, they issue a bond. And when you buy a bond, you're basically loaning the issuer of that bond money. And sometimes you hear about bond yields. A yield is simply, in essence, the interest rate that investment pays you, right? The current yield paid on a bond is the rate of return on the bond, aka interest rates. It's the annual interest rate payment divided by the bond's price. Now, a principal objective of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve open market the principal objective of the Federal Reserve open market activity is to alter the price of bonds, thereby manipulating their interest rates. The less you pay for a bond, the higher the interest rate. So in other words, when you look at this equation here, if the Federal Reserve buys bonds, that means bonds are going to be more scarce, right? And that's going to drive up the price. When the price goes up, the yield falls, interest rates fall. If they sell bonds, that means there's more bonds out there in the market. That means the price goes down, and that means the yield goes up. That's one of the reasons why sometimes you hear the price of bonds and yields are inversely related. So the mechanism used by the Fed to manipulate the banking system reserves is very simple. It buys or sells government securities on the open market. And when the Fed buys the securities, the seller then deposits the proceeds of the sale in their banks, thereby affecting the amount of reserves in the system. Now, specifically, or in particular, the New York Federal Reserve Board, New York Federal Reserve Bank, they are in charge of the buying and selling of government securities based upon the direction of the FOMC. And what they do is the New York Fed buys securities on behalf of the Fed from a group of security dealers. The New York Fed pays for the securities by creating funds. They can create money by simply electronic debits or credits, right? They creating the accounts that the dealers' banks have at the Fed. These banks in turn credit the dealers' accounts. The banking system now has excess reserves that may be lent to other banks. Now, when they sell securities, the New York Fed sells the securities on the behalf of the Federal Reserve, and the Fed gets paid for the securities by debiting the accounts that the dealers' banks have at the Fed. These banks in turn debit the dealers' accounts. The banking system now has fewer reserves, which means it has less money than before. So that's basically how it works overall. And this is the most common tool used by the Federal Reserve, is open market operations. And they usually announce this at their meetings that happen about 5 or 6 times a year. But sometimes they will change monetary policy in between meetings, so it doesn't always happen during the official meetings of the Federal Reserve. So what we're going to do now is, now that we know about how money is created through banks, who is in charge of regulating those banks, the Federal Reserve, and we looked at the tools the Federal Reserve has to manipulate the aggregate demand curve, we're now going to be looking at monetary policy in general in the next chapter.